As we continue making waves through this summer with the images of the water through the scriptures, I will admit that this Old Testament passage is one that I've never preached before. And so as I was looking at the visions that Ezekiel gets, he gets visions that tell God's people what it is they've done wrong. They end up being exiled. And then as they come back, they are quite distraught. They feel that they've been destroyed and that perhaps God has abandoned them. And so in these chapters towards the end of Ezekiel begins to draw for them a new vision. And this reading is a part of that vision. Hear these words from the 47th chapter, the first 5 verses. Then the Spirit brought me back to the entrance of the temple. There water was flowing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. And the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And the water was coming out on the south side. Going on eastward with a cord in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits, then led me through the water. It was ankle deep. Again, he measured 1,000 cubits and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again, he measured 1,000 cubits and led me through the water, and it was up to my waist. And again, he measured 1,000 cubits, and it was a river that I could not cross, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be crossed. This is the word of God for the people of God. For that we give thanks in the reading and the hearing. And then from our gospel, perhaps a familiar story. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at a story kind of like this from the 8th chapter of Matthew, of Jesus asleep in the boat in the midst of a storm. Well, a storm has come up again, and the disciples again are in the boat at night, but this time Jesus is not with them. So I invite you to hear these words from the 14th chapter of Matthew, beginning with the 22nd verse. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, Jesus went up the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. What kind of a getter-inner the water are you? Are you the one who kind of touches your toe in the water to see what the temperature is? And then maybe you sit on the side and you dangle your feet in the water, maybe up to your knees, and you begin to splash water on yourself to try to get your body used to whatever the temperature is. Do you look for the gentle set of steps that go into the shallow end and make your way slowly down them, just letting the water begin to lap up against you? Or are you the cannonballer? Are you the one who, while the other person is sitting on the side, you take note of where they are? And without them knowing, you run behind them, right beside them, and landing just in front of them, you ball yourself up and you splash them so they'll know what the temperature of the water is. What about when you go to the ocean? Do you walk along the seashore for a ways and decide really the ocean isn't meant to get in as much as it is just to be waded in, looking out at the vast expanse? Or are you the one that throws your shoes off over your shoulders and runs as fast as you can into the waves? And when the waves get too high for you to be able to lift your feet, you put your hands over your head and you dive into the next wave that comes, exhilarated by the rush. See, The question is, how do each of us ride the waves of a gentle sea or a pool, or maybe one which is more turbulent? It's sort of hard to pin down water, isn't it? Because you see, water is life-giving and life-refreshing, and without it, we literally cannot exist. We will not live without water. At the same time, water can also be, in a tsunami or a hurricane, life-destructive and life-destroying, overwhelming to us in oh so many ways. So how is it that we ride all those waves, knowing that in them is the power of God? Remember several weeks ago when we looked at the origin of the origin stories, those first 5 verses of Genesis, and we saw that the earth was a formless void and darkness covered the face of the deep, and that God's Spirit moved, swept, or even danced across the face of the waters. And while it's wonderful to think about God dancing with the possibility of creation, also notice that life was not able to come into existence. Creation was not able to happen until God put structure to the chaos, the formless void. When God separated the waters from the earth, the heavens from what was below, the seas pushed back light from darkness. God brought structure to those wild and turbulent waves so that life could exist. It is kind of 2 sides of the same coin, if you will. The promise of life that water gives, and refreshment and vibrancy, and also the fear of that destructive force that you can't contain finally or control. Water always wins, a friend of mine who's a plumber says. So Ezekiel, this morning in our readings, Ezekiel has spent much of the first 45 chapters having visions of the coming destruction and then the destruction as it happens. And now is trying to create a new vision for a people that are coming back home, and they're despondent and they are distraught and they're not certain that they have the kind of value that God will want to renew life for them. And so Ezekiel talks about the Spirit helping him to see a vision. The temple has been restored, but in Ezekiel's vision, the temple is rebuilt. And it's in the center of the city, of the holy city, and it's of grand nature. And he notices as the Spirit leads him around the temple to show him that there is water coming under the threshold of the eastern gate, and the temple faces east. And then the Spirit takes him on around, and from each side of the temple, underneath the threshold, flow waters, streams of living water. And finally, the Spirit brings him back to the east side, and they begin to follow the water. And 1,000 cubits is about 1/3 of a mile. And so in 1/3 of the mile, they're wading in the water, and it's ankle deep. And then the Spirit leads him another 1/3 of the mile, and now it's knee deep. And the Spirit leads him another 1/3 of a mile east, and now it's waist deep. And then in another 1/3 of the mile, it's too high to even stand in. And Ezekiel says you could swim in it, but it was not going to be crossed by a mortal. It was too fast, too high, and too deep. And Ezekiel has some consternation towards the Spirit about this water, this river being too turbulent, too wide and too deep. And the Spirit says, oh, but you don't understand, Ezekiel. This water is flowing down to the Dead Sea. The sea that has so many minerals in it, we know, realistically, it has so many minerals in it that neither fish nor any kind of plants can live in it. And what the Spirit says is, this water flowing from the temple of God will reach its way to the lowest point, which is where the Dead Sea exists, and it will bring life. And that sea will become vibrant with flowers and plants and fish. And along the banks, trees will grow, and nothing will wither. That's what the power of God is able to do to renew life for God's people. And then the Spirit said, had I read on, and then the Spirit says to Ezekiel, and the land along the rivers that is so welcoming of growth and new life, they're to be divided between the 12 tribes of Israel. And limits are to be put around the area for each tribe, so there never needs to be conflict or confrontation or violence. That there is enough of God's abundance for everyone. And no one needs to be left out. How do you feel about limits? Are you fond of them? Think about when you were young and your parent says, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're not quite tall enough to go on this ride in Disneyland or at a fair." And you stomp your feet and you cannot wait until that limit is taken off. Or you have to wait until you're 14 or 15 to get your driver's permit, and you know that you're ready to drive before that, but you have to wait because there's a limit. There's an age limit. How did you feel about bedtime limits? My parents set that limit at 8 o'clock when I was young. I don't know how long it lasted. I just knew that I had to go to bed before Carol Burnett started. I thought that was extremely unfair. And then when I was in high school, my curfew was at 11 o'clock. That wasn't nearly late enough for someone as mature and responsible as I was as a teen student. And at the same time that we pushed against those limits also helped us know that someone loved us, that someone cared enough to say to us, what's best for you is to be home at this time. What's best for you is to get this amount of sleep. What's best for you is not to go on a ride that they can't buckle you in securely because you're too small. So limits are that which we push against, but they're also that which are life-giving. It sounds a little bit like the power of the waves that we can't pin down. How about when you were in the middle of your working life? How did limits appear to you then? Maybe you and your spouse or family members went out and you got a house with a 30-year mortgage. And you know what? Those payments are required every single month. If you're renting an apartment, those payments are required every single month. There is a limit to what you can do and not do in order to have a place to live, in order to pay utilities. We have PTO, sick leave. We have vacation time. But there's a limit to it, isn't it? There's a limit. Maybe it's a week. Maybe it's 2 weeks. And what we understand in the United States is very few people ever take the total amount of their paid time off because we think we're too valuable, because we don't think our workplace can do without us, because we know that we'll fall so far behind while we're gone that it's just not worth it to do all the catching back up. Or we take our tablets or our cell phones or our computers with us so that we can work while we are vacating. We're not good with limits that tell us we need time to refresh and renew. And we're not good with limits that tell us we need to work this amount of hours. We're sometimes just not good with limitations, are we? And yet some of those limits are meant to be life-giving and life-sustaining. How about in our aging years? We're sort of happy, I think, that there is a limit to our working life. We look forward to retirement. That will be the time when we experience life-giving. We're going to work 80 hours a week until we get to that time, because once we get to that time, everything will be perfect and marvelous and wonderful. And how many people who retire find their way back to their work in a year or less? Because the unstructured time doesn't give them what feels like purpose or meaning. We need to plan. We need to prepare. We need to put structure, maybe even limits on our leisure so that we still have a direction. How do we ride the waves of that which limits us to sustain us? How do we ride the waves of those limits that need to be pushed against so that we can define ourselves? That's really part of the human condition of how we learn to live together in this world. The disciples this morning are again in a boat, but this time Jesus isn't with them. He has again told them to go to the other side. He's just finished feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. People that followed him out into the wilderness. He could not get away from them. They all needed healing. They all needed sustaining. They all needed love. They all needed compassion. And so the disciples want to send them away. I think they're exhausted. I think they know Jesus is exhausted. But Jesus says, no, we need to feed them. And so he does. And after that's over, he receives word that his friend John the Baptist, the one who prepared the way for his ministry, the one who baptized him, that John the Baptist has been killed. So he says to the disciples, I need you to get in this boat and go to the other side. And I'm going to go by myself to the hills to pray, to renew, to rejuvenate. Understand this, Jesus also knows limits. It's the limit of life and the span of life. John the Baptist has died. They were contemporaries, related distantly. And so he's facing that limitation that tells us that there is a finite number of days for all of us. So it says that in the third watch of the night, Jesus starts towards the boat that by now is out in the middle of the sea, in the midst of a storm, with wind and waves that are threatening to swamp the boat. And the disciples are filled with fear. Jesus is not in the boat this time to wake up. And by the way, it's the third watch of the night is basically 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. I don't know about you, but if I'm awake at 3 a.m., I very rarely have positive thoughts. If I'm awake at 3 a.m., I can usually list everything I've ever done wrong. I can usually list everybody's feelings I've ever hurt. I can usually list every weakness that I have. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's for you as well. So maybe it's no wonder that the disciples are so quaking with fear in the third watch of the night, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a sea, that when they look out and they see a figure coming towards them across the water, they cry out, not, oh, yay, it's Jesus. They cry out, it's a ghost. And they huddle together in fear. And then they hear a voice. Remember, we talked about Jesus' voice last week that told the disciples to throw their nets out on the other side of the boat because they hadn't been catching any fish, and how Peter knew the risen Christ through the abundant catch. Jesus' voice comes to them across the water. It is I, don't be afraid. Translators would tell us that when Jesus says, it is I, it would be better translated as, it is I am. Remember when Moses said, who shall I say is sending me to lead the people to freedom? And God says, tell them, I am has sent me. I am who I am, and I will be who I will be, God says. Jesus says, don't be afraid. It is I am. Peter says, well, if it is, tell me to come to you walking on the water. And Jesus says, come. You see, it's that decision, right? Is this life-giving water? Is this life-sustaining water? Is this life-redeeming water? Or is this life-destroying water? Is it threatening and destructive? It's hard to pin water down, isn't it? It's hard to understand our limits and whether they're life-giving or life-reducing. Peter throws off the limits and he begins to walk toward Jesus on the water. But human beings do have limits. And the wind hits him in the face, the wind that was against them from the beginning. And he begins to sink. And he cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reaches out and lifts him up and brings him back to the boat. And then says, oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? And where the disciples, the first time there's a storm and they're in the middle of the sea and they wake up Jesus and Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves, they say, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" This time they're further along in ministry. They've experienced more with Jesus. And this time they say, "Surely you are the Son of God." The affirmation of faith comes from overcoming their fear of the storm with faith in this Jesus who is the I am. So where does that leave us in the midst of the turbulent waters that we seem to be riding right now as people and as a country? Where does it leave us in a willingness to either push against limits that are life-reducing or live within limits that are life-sustaining? And where is it that we are willing to allow God to direct us, to transform us, to renew us, to remind us that, well, what the disciples recognized is that Jesus was Jesus and they were not. Truly, this is the Son of God, meaning truly we are not. It's sort of hard to remember sometimes that we're not in total control of everything all the time. Oh, we become aware of it when we hear the word cancer for ourselves or someone we love. We become aware of it when we get that phone call that says our spouse or our child or someone we know has been picked up for drunk driving or drug possession. We become very aware of what we're not in control of when we're at the wrong place at the wrong time and we're T-boned and left with chronic injuries that will not ever easily be resolved. But we have to wait to understand that life is from a God of great grace and blessing, who will be with us in the most turbulent waters we face, as well as with us sitting on the side of the pool, splashing ourselves to get used to the temperature. That our God will not abandon us to the dry and arid destruction of our own making, but instead will bring rivers out of the threshold of God's sacred space that may reach our ankles and our knees and our waist, and then be so far beyond us that it will bring life in ways we cannot even imagine, and God simply invites us to receive it. So friends, I'm going to invite you into a time of reflection just now. And you'll see in those questions the heart of, I think, God's message for us. What are the limits that are life-giving and life-sustaining, and are we willing to live within them? And what are the limits that are life-reducing for ourselves and others that God would have us push against, that all might receive the joy of God's love? Let's reflect together.